Be here today, of course, on a history of American lighthouses. So first of all, thank you very, very much to the library for hosting us. Y'all have been very, very sweet, and thank you especially for all the services that you guys provide, just libraries in general. And thank you each and every one of you for attending. So here we go. And here we do not go. Okay. I told you, computers hate me. Okay. It is not going. Trying both. Okay.
Your little fob is right here.
What is a fob?
This thing.
Oh, so, I did not even notice that.
So that should...
Okay, pardon our technical difficulties right here. You can tell I'm a 1980s kid. It's like a Sega Genesis cartridge. When in doubt, take it out and blow on it.
There you go. Here, you can just use these two keys. This one goes.
Okay. Yes. Okay. And now for something completely different. All right. Try and be all like serious and John Cleese sitting behind a desk. All right. So I am Mandy Apgar, and I am here on behalf of the Pennsylvania Earth Sciences Association, better known as PESA. And we were chartered in 1964 by a group of Lehigh Valley area Earth Sciences enthusiasts. One of our members, Marge Matula, is in her mid-90s. She is still with us, as feisty as ever. I love her to bits. And she discovered her own mineral even, Matulaite. And so Marge explained it to me about a year ago that basically she, her husband, and a couple of friends, they just wanted to form an organization where people could get together in a safe space, like be like, hey, what mineral is this, without being, say, judged or any snarky comments or compare lapidary tips, things like that. And so we do meetings, and now we do rock and mineral shows twice a year at Mineral Fest, they're called. They are the first Saturday in both June and October. And our main website is our Facebook page, where I am known as Thy Humble Admin, no pun intended. And our goal there is to promote pretty much the same things that we do in the club. We'll do various local and news tidbits just related to the geosciences. I do videos at least once a week on a variety of topics. I'll do special presentations for organizations like this or Scouts, and, you know, occasionally get threatened by flat earthers. So it's all good. Okay, now we've already gone through a little bit of a welcome from where I'm coming from. So we're going to look at some terminology, historic houses, what I call Rise of the American Lighthouse, and a little bit of history and culture towards the end. So some of the terms. Now, if people can't really see this too good at the end, I'm going to go through a lot of this, so don't worry. Now, first of all, the main, I just call it a stalk. So the main central stalk, so to speak, of the lighthouse is what's called a tower. Atop that, where you have the lenses, the glass enclosure, is the lantern. Now, typically, there are two different types of lights. There's what's called a flashing light, bless you, and a stationary light. A flashing light is simply a light that just flashes at intervals, or just a light that flashes. A stationary one is one that is fixed in a standard position, it doesn't move, or one that shines light in a consistent manner. So now, right beneath the lantern room is the watch room. That's where the keeper can look out, see weather conditions, things like that. And then along there is a enclosed walkway called the gallery. So they can just pop out there and take a better look at things. So let us begin. Now, if there's one thing that doing educational programs on the internet has taught me is that people like to argue over the most random things humanly possible when it comes to historical details. One of the things is the Colossus of Roads. So one of the contenders for the world's first lighthouse, the Colossus, was constructed about 294 to 282 BCE. It was in Rhodes, of course, and is a 110-foot high statue made in bronze dedicated to the god Helios. Why do we not know more about something that is obviously this awesome looking? Well, that is because Rhodes is in a earthquake belt, and several major earthquakes actually toppled it. Let me X some of this out. See if I can get it out of there. No, I can't. Okay. All right. Well, anyway, what happened is an earthquake, knocked it over, went boom, there you go. So that is why we don't really know that much about it. But the thing is that it most likely had a lighthouse aspect to it. There was one arm that was probably held aloft. We're not really sure why, because we don't have the ruins of it. We don't really know that much more about it. And the probable actual contender for the world's first lighthouse instead of that one is the Pharos of Alexandria. This we do have some of the ruins for. I know, I've been in Egypt, they're right there. So it was constructed about 297 to 283 BCE, and you can see it's in tiers. So it was a white stone lighthouse made out of various granite, limestone, marble, total of 443 feet high. Now, it also was put into an earthquake belt. Egypt has a lot of earthquakes, actually, and it was damaged by several of them until finally it was replaced by a fortress in 1479. Now, it gave its name to the study of lighthouses, which is pharaology. So that is why the study of lighthouses is called pharaology. It's after the pharaohs. And today, if you actually go to Alexandria, they have scuba diving trips where you can go in between the ruins. They're really, really blasted huge, of the Pharos itself. Now, in terms of one that's older that is still with us, you can look no further than the Tower of Hercules, right there. It was built in Spain in the 1st or 2nd century CE. Obviously, it looks a lot like the Pharos. That is completely intentional. It was modeled on it, and it is about 180 feet tall with a total renovation done in 1791. It's also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Now, some of the lighthouses that are coming up, we don't really know that much about them completely. The problem with a lot of early ones is that obviously they were made out of wood, and it's not like people keep records of things all the time. But we'll kind of go over the important stuff of what is known. Now, this one is not an American one, but it's actually European. Eddystone Rock, or the Winstanley Lighthouse, is the first known offshore lighthouse. It was constructed to avoid the, quote, dreaded Eddystone rocks. It's pretty much wherever I would see that phrase, they always put the dreaded in front of it, which kind of sounds like very Princess Bride, like the dreaded Pirate Roberts, but they were dreaded, and it was a terrible, terrible area where there were a lot of shipwrecks. And the first version, which is on the very far left, which was lit on November 14th of 1698. It was destroyed in a storm, unfortunately, in 1703, and eventually you wound up being 120 foot tall and 4 successive stages of them. So it's kind of like that thing in Monty Python and the Holy Grail where the guy's talking about building a castle in the swamp. It's like the 3rd time it caught on fire, it fell over, but the 4th time it stayed up. So that's exactly what happened with Eddystone Rock. The 4th time it finally stayed up. And something like that, it became very iconic. A lot of people saw it, a lot of people liked it. And then obviously across the seas, the colonists were like, maybe we could get some of that. And so people started petitioning the crown for their own lighthouse. And the first folks that were listened to were actually Boston. So by the early 1700s, there were 70 total lighthouses worldwide, with 14 in England. And October 14th of 1716, the Boston Lighthouse became the first one in America, 60 foot tall with a 15-foot lantern room. Now, it was mildly controversial at times for a really, really weird reason. It had lightning rods on it. Now, lightning rods were seen by some people to kind of subvert God's will. It was a viewpoint where basically, if not to speak for the Almighty, but it was okay, if God wanted to just strike this place and burn it down with everybody inside, then that would be his viewpoint. So we shouldn't put any lightning rods on there. And there was actually a lot of argument going back and forth about this, but fortunately, cooler heads prevailed for the sake of the keepers and everyone else. And they actually did put the lightning rods on it, and they wound up being so successful that other people saw this, and future lighthouses were then built. So Nantucket gained the second one in 1746, and in 1749, Rhode Island became the third. That right there is the Boston Lighthouse, which, as befitting many things in Boston, looks like a postcard and is absolutely adorable. So early colonial lighthouses in wartime. Boston, Philadelphia, a lot of our main cities are port cities. So a lot of them started getting lighthouses with them other than Boston. Philly got one in December of 1765. Sandy Hook, New York, which is on the left right there, the picture, was on June the 11th of 1764. It was 103 feet tall. And obviously these lighthouses are central to the Revolution. Now, one big thing that people kind of get not really wrong about lighthouses, but sort of mistaken about things, is that they're not really there to mark dangerous shoals and what have you. They're just there to mark ports in the beginning. But as we're being attacked, as we're being invaded, people more and more started to realize the strategic importance of what they could be and sort of alternative uses, just instead of saying, hey, there's a port here. And so what they wound up doing was, as these invading forces would come in, say Boston was targeted, Boston was severely damaged, and Sandy Hook, the colonists, actually took it apart so that way it wouldn't fall into enemy hands. But then the British troops just put it right back together, and for some time they actually took it over themselves. Because, you know, they had Eddystone, so they're not stupid, and they know what a lighthouse could be. So right here we have post-revolution. Now, prior to all of that happening, funding for a lighthouse was done by taxes and lotteries. So Congress turned to the federal government. Why? Well, George Washington cited a phrase in the Constitution whereby giving regulation of foreign and domestic commerce was the responsibility of the federal government. So he signed the act on August 7th of 1789, which is why August 7th is, huzzah, National Lighthouse Day today. Now, at the time, we had 12 on the East Coast, with 3 added soon after. There was Portland Head, Tybee, and then one other one that we'll get into soon, Cape Henry. That is, I believe, Tybee Beach is right there, but it's being cut off. Now, this here is Portland Head Lighthouse, which is very consistently ranked within the top 5 globally in terms of just how absolutely majestic it is. It was built in 1791, well lit, was 101 feet high, and the keeper's house is now a museum. Right there is Cape Henry. And so war and peacetime. Obviously, we won, so thank goodness. And 34 more lighthouses were added prior to the War of 1812, which obviously the conditions put a damper on funding. But then once all that was over, people really started to expand the commercial aspects of having a lighthouse, just accommodating shipping and everything. And so with commerce exploding, the demand for lighthouses is exploding, especially too because they're seen as a symbol of the reborn America. I mean, just in the past, say, 2 weeks, I've seen lighthouses on t-shirts for Nantucket, Cape May, places out in California. This one lady had one on a t-shirt I saw in San Francisco. I mean, they're very, in many ways, a uniquely American symbol that we have taken and kind of made our own, which is a very American trait, I think. And one of the things that makes us really awesome is taking these things and adapting them to our own country and our own needs. Now, most of these lighthouses were built, these new ones, in New England. The tallest there, at 133 feet on the left, is Boone Island. Now, this right here is Cape Hatteras. It stands over a part of the ocean that was so dangerous it was called the Graveyard of the Atlantic. It was lit in 1803, and it was first 90, then 150 foot tall. They actually found out that the first time it was built very poorly, so took it down, started over, did things all anew. This right here is Montauk, was lit in 1797, 110 foot 6 inches high, do not forget those 6 inches, and is the 4th oldest active lighthouse in the nation, and is also our first public works project. So early technology, how was all this lit? How did this come about? The first lamps obviously had tallow candles, which were braided wicks, and the oil was from whales, seals, fish, different things. But then by the beginning of the 19th century, sperm oil became an important fuel. The spermaceti organ is an organ in the whale's head, which is where we got this oil from. It's a big yellow thing, like right up top right there. It weighs about 20 pounds. The oil from it is very, very smoky, but it was effective. It was usually burned in a specialty type of lamp called spider lamps, and the light that was produced was a little bit better. Still, overall, it was an improvement over what they had before. Now, speaking of improvements, here we have the argon lamp. So in 1782, Jaime Argon created a new oil lamp, which instead of that single hollow solid wick, you had that hollow circular tube, which was gravity fed and held up by brass. So what does that do? That increases your oxygen input, which of course, pretty much everybody knows, oxygen and fire, they kind of go hand in hand, right? So combining that with a parabolic reflector, he increased the light and was able to focus it more. These new lamps were a very, very big hit in Europe, not so in our country. Why? Because a lot of people over here at the time were using lamps designed by Winslow Lewis in 1774. He patterned them, note the air quotes, after popular European models. They were made very similar, but they used less oil, and that's why a lot of them were made over here. And talking about Lewis, that leads us sadly into what some people call, no pun intended, the dark period in American lighthouses. It began in about the 1820s. So it all began with a policy change. So what caused this troublesome period here of actually over a generation? Well, it all became when a couple of people made a very, very stupid idea. They gave responsibility for selecting and building lighthouses in this country not to any type of board of mariners or say military personnel, people with knowledge, or any engineers. No, it was given to the Treasury Department's fifth auditor, one Stephen Pleasanton. And I will forever feel sorry for that guy because that is the picture that he is going to be known by, and he looks like Dr. Zayas in Planet of the Apes. So I feel so sorry for him, even though he, turned out to be a bit of a nut. And in 1820, there were 55 lighthouses in the nation. That increased to 325 in 1852. So yes, he did an exponential increase, but the thing is, why is that a problem? Well, I was a construction inspector for about 10 years. If there was one thing that made me look really, really askance at a project when I came in, well, one of several things, it was a rush job. Because rush jobs often imply that people are hiding things. They don't want you to know stuff. And that was the problem. They kept putting these things up so pell-mell, just piggly wiggly. There were no checks and balances in the system. So nobody was coming back to these places and seeing, okay, are they built well? Are they built, very importantly, are they built safely? Will they actually function? Nobody was checking on this. And also, too, now somebody could just go up to him and be like, hey, Steve, I'm a mayor of Wakanda. I want a lighthouse like just right by us. He's like, okay, here you go. But he would give the contract to always the lowest possible bidder. And again, not to knock the guy, but still, what it created was a total stagnation in American technology when it came to really marine engineering, when it came to lighthouses. And because without this funding or advanced technology at all, things really came to kind of a screeching halt for quite a while. Now, meanwhile, over in Europe, a lot of European people were continuing things, especially in Augustin Jean Fresnel, engineer, scientist, and as I call him, fountain of common sense. Now, he came up with an idea called lenses by steps. Now, he realized that no one lens could be perfect for all environments. I mean, really, that doesn't make any sense. So why were people trying to market the same lens for the same kinds of lighthouses? It just doesn't work. So what he wound up doing was he came up with a lens, which is attached to his name, that changes the way they can process available light. It makes the beam stronger and travel farther. His ideas were so revolutionary that he actually wound up being held in because the glass technology at the time was not up to par with his ideas. So at first, he only had 4 what he called orders, or sizes really, of these lights. The biggest was a 6-foot lens for seacoast. Now this is diameter. So picture a 6-foot diameter light. And then the smallest one was 1 foot for like little harbor lights. Now, here's the genius himself. He was lost very, very young, sadly, to, I believe, tuberculosis. And there's one of his lenses on the left. It looks kind of, I think, almost like a fly's eye, compound eye, which kind of gives you the idea of how it was able to achieve what it did. Now, this fellow on the left is Winslow Lewis. He was a guy that I mentioned a little while ago. He came up with that lamp that was being used a lot in America. So he got really, really mad at a couple of people. So the editors of American Coast Pilot, it was a sort of journal that published a lot of maritime papers, maps, things like that. The editors were two brothers, the Blunts. They saw what they decried as a very dangerous series of conditions in the American lighthouse system, which they were right. Things were very, very bad. I mean, obviously, without any way to mark our ports, without any way to protect these coastlines, after seafarers have become so used to it for so long, what do you happen? Crashes went up exponentially. There was a loss in lives, a loss in shipping, and it was just, you would talk to the people involved and they just basically had wax in their ears. And so the Blunts did a blasting series of editorials saying, okay, now something has to be done, because sadly, I hate to say this, but with how many things in this world, how often does it happen that somebody has to die before a change is made? But it was the same thing here. So Pleasanton and Lewis obviously were not very happy with this, and they responded with very, very big, just angry editorials and all sorts of these big newspapers with fake statistics to justify their data, which, if you're going to do something that stupid, at least not come up with data that you just basically pull out of the air that the people that you're arguing against can just be like, not very smart. And then things got even more bad when Lewis's nephew, one I.W.P. Lewis, who became known as the father of the American lighthouse system, which obviously with a name like that, he's not on the side of his uncle. He sided with the Blunts and he started blasting his uncle, which probably would have made for really, really good family reunions. I mean, can you imagine that? And like, hey, you remember when you accused me of murder 5 years ago? It's, a bit dicey. But because of this and the younger Lewis really, really going for just safety and everything, Congress put a hold on actually Pleasanton and funding lighthouses. So people were kind of sort of starting to listen. Now, so they had decided to do an investigation. Naval officers inspected each and every lighthouse in the country. 40% were shot. 40%. That's frightening. That's why so many people were dying. We were losing so many ships because 40% of our lighthouses weren't functional. I mean, if you think of something like that, like 40% of, say, airports today, we wouldn't be able to function as a society. We just wouldn't. So the majority of the stable ones, big surprise, were from the colonial period. In other words, they were before all the cost-cutting measures cut in. Now, it was decided to build a lighthouse according to engineering standards, which is this one on the left right here. It's built in Florida. I'll get into it in a minute. And oddly enough, one of the overriding things that they found, they were not built tall enough. The light just physically couldn't reach to people. They were not built tall enough. Now, that little equation right there, D equals 1.17 times the square root of the height, like the height of the lighthouse itself, that determines the distance as to how far out light reaches. That may be a very, very simple equation, but oh my stars, do we have a lot of drama over that one simple thing that people didn't even take into account. Now, the outcry over this was massive, but sadly, because both Pleasanton and Lewis were very well connected, despite Congress basically calling for both their heads on a stick, nothing was ever done to them. So eventually, we had success. Now, Congress wound up installing a brand new Fresnel lens in Navesink Lighthouse in Jersey. People loved it. Pleasanton and Lewis' response was that they couldn't install these new lighthouses in this country because lighthouse keepers were too stupid to operate them. So you can imagine how lighthouse keepers and their families responded to that. That's not good when you shade the people that you're trying to get on your side. That was not very smart. And that lighthouse that we just saw back there, that was Careysport Reef. That was built to standard in Florida. It opened in March the 10th of 1852. Another little quirk with that one was that it was also supposed to have brand new, really highfalutin lenses. They were ordered, but because of all this drama and everything going on, shipping and the people at the freight never unpacked them. So they sat in the harbor, Finally, they were kind of put into storage and they were sold at a lost property auction of sorts. So the people opened up the boxes and they're like, holy crap, because they knew what they had. So it was quite a bit of a surprise. And then finally, over 30 years after all of this mess started, it took 32 years for things to change. Just think about that. The bill for creating the Lighthouse Board was sent to Congress. Now, still, Pleasanton and Lewis and their people, because they had a very powerful faction, you have to keep in mind, they thought that everything was going to go good, that their jobs were going to be fine, that all was going to be safe. But then several members of Congress were on a ship called the Baltic. It was heading to New York, and it depended upon, you guessed it, a lighthouse that had been built improperly and was too short. So this boat with all of these members of Congress floundered. Thank God everybody was okay, because, you know, although they are of Congress, we do not want to wish them well or badly, right? You know, right? Wink, wink. And so, but the thing is that they then saw what everybody had been talking about. They personally dealt with, oh my God, I'm on a ship, it's sinking. There are very, very few fears more primal, I think, than that of drowning. And all of these people with all of this power in their hands to vote those nutballs out of existence, for that to happen, it happened. And so they spoke with their pens and they voted the Lighthouse Board into being on August 31st of 1852, a glorious day for science and engineering and safety in this country and really around the world. So right here is Navesink, of course. There is the Lighthouse Board. So this is one of the first original board members. His name is Alexander Dallas Bach. I think he looks a lot like his great-grandfather from The Nose on Up. It was kind of a running joke at the time that Benjamin Franklin, that was his granddad, that he had so many grandsons in engineering that you basically couldn't throw a stick at a meeting without hitting a grandson of Benjamin Franklin. Well, there's one. Now, at the time the Lighthouse Board took over, they began with 325 houses, almost half of which, if we found out, were faulty. So the first act that they did was they rechecked every single one. They scrapped several as being too poorly built, or they scrapped a couple just not being necessity. I mean, why did you put this here? You don't need a lighthouse here. So they got rid of them. And they developed a new system for reviewing locations. Now, despite all of this, by 1859, they increased to 425 lighthouses, which is actually more of an increase and doing it safely with proper standards than were done beforehand. Now, mostly all of these lenses were the European style, the Fresnel ones, and they generated not only 4 times the light of the outdated lights, but they used a quarter of the oil. So now you're probably wondering during this whole entire thing, well, we keep talking about lighthouses on the East Coast, all of these are East, so what about West? You know, what's going on there? Another one of the Lighthouse Board's first acts was to remedy that, and I just mentally skipped a slide, so pause that mentally for a second while we go on to Cape May. So built in 1859, it was the 3rd lighthouse at Cape May Point. It has been on the National Register of Historic Places as of November 12th of 1973. It is utterly gorgeous. It is 157 feet, 6 inches, and is 217 steps. My legs aren't the best, and I am terrified of heights, so it's not the type of thing that I would do. But if you do go in there, they actually have a thing where you can have a brick put into the lighthouse with the name of a fallen military member. So it's a very, very kind thing that they do. Now, this is what I was leading up to, and I forgot about the position of the Cape May slide, forgive me. So obviously, why do we have no West Coast lighthouses? Lighthouse Board, you know what? We'll fix that. They approved 8 of them. 7 were in California, 1 of them were in Oregon. But because of delays and everything, the one in California was built so far ahead of the others, one of them. It was lit on June the 1st of 1854, very, very far ahead of everybody else. And it's right over there on the right. You can see it sticking up across from the barracks of today. Yes, I said barracks. That is Arn. Yes, thank you. I heard that. According to popular myth, the island was not known by the Anglicization of its name, Pelican Island. Locally, it was known as La Isla de las Alcatraces, which does mean the island of the pelicans, which of course was later shortened to Alcatraz. That is Alcatraz Island itself, which at the time was a fort. It was not a prison until after, of all things, the San Francisco earthquake created the idea to do that, which is a story in of itself. So the Civil War, time goes on, and all of these other battles led to problems just like the colonial period. People from the north are going down to the south, dismantling their lighthouses, and then vice versa, and it got to be this big mess. So Lincoln ordered a blockage of southern coast ports. He intended to strangle them from importing war materials, which that was a great idea. And yes, he was right in that aspect. But what it really did was it just ticked him off all the more. So more people kept sneaking up north and breaking more of the northern lighthouses. Now, one of the most famous quotes in naval engineering or just naval history, which was "damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead," was actually done because of, in effect, lighthouses during the Civil War. So more or less, torpedoes were a word for marine mines, and they couldn't see, this was a northern battle, they couldn't see where they were going because the lighthouse wasn't there. The Southerners had damaged the lighthouses, and they're just, well, we can't see what we're doing, we don't know what we're doing, and a lot of the people wanted to chicken out, but the guy in charge was just like, screw the mines, full steam ahead. Now, Reconstruction. So obviously the war did not last forever, and later on, when the Bureau went to go put together a lot of these lights, they found that many locals had stolen valuable pieces. Now, they did this expecting a reward later on. A lot of people kind of came in and was like, hey, well, I have such and such in my basement, maybe, probably, I'll give it to you for, I don't know, $500. So instead of expecting a reward, what they got was a theft warrant unless they complied immediately to return all the pieces. So yes, the government got all those pieces back, a lot of them voluntarily, some of them not so voluntarily, but it worked, including Cape Hatteras's massive lens. What did I say, lens? I figures I proofread this umpteen times and I still have one mistake. Including Cape Hatteras's massive lens was one of the ones recovered. But after it was recovered, the reason it looks so, well, bad on the end there is that it then became a kind of a tourist attraction for people to go in there and break a piece off the bloody lens, which is very self-defeating, but you know what? That's kind of why our species can have nice things, because of a handful of really, really stupid people that mess it up for everybody else. Now, another little cute story that I liked was when agents in North Carolina were packing up their lenses, trying to bring them back into the proper lighthouses. They apparently needed packing equipment. So what these northern agents did was, apparently, and this wasn't discovered until 40 years later, they actually raided the state archive for packing material. And so thank God none of these papers were destroyed, because the papers that they used to pack all these lenses with were actually personal papers of Thomas Jefferson and a lot of their founding fathers and things. And this guy just opened up this box and found all these crumpled papers in here. And I would have passed out. I would have probably peed myself and passed out seeing all that. I really would have. Now, times were changing, and long-running issues over sperm oil led to concerns over what do we do to replace that. Well, one of the little interesting quinky dinks of history is that oil was not discovered in this country in where you would think, say, like Texas, California. It was in Titusville, PA, in dee-dee-doo in 1859. And the new fuel for lamps became, instead of sperm oil, kerosene. A common lamp that came about at the time was called incandescent oil vapor lamps. When the Cape Hatteras lighthouse was redone, it became the tallest in the country. And within 6 years of its creation, the Lighthouse Board went from 325 to 800 lighthouses. So within 600 years, they had that, 60 years, they had that much of an expansion. And even with, say, like buoys and lightships, in 1852, when they took over, there was only 2,500 buoys. beacons and lightships. By 1910, there was 11,000. Now, one very, very famous gal that people don't really realize was originally in many ways a lighthouse is Statue of Liberty herself. God bless her. So in 1886, Grover Cleveland himself determined that Lady Liberty should have a lighthouse function, obviously the torch. It was lit at 7:35 p.m. on November 1st of 1886. She became fully operational on November 22nd. It sounds crass to say the Statue of Liberty was fully operational. I feel bad saying that, but I don't know. Now, the torch is 305 foot above sea level. At the time, it had 9 carbon arc lamps that could light 24 miles out. Could being a subjective term. The openings were so small that you could barely get any light out of them. And the local New Yorkers actually called the torch the, quote, the glowworm. It was sort of a local object of ridicule, and it got to be so bad that the lighthouse function was discontinued in 1902. Now, keeping up appearances, so things that they did to kind of change things. The candy stripe markings are called day marks properly. They came up in the 1850s. Now, after that San Francisco earthquake I mentioned, after that, in 2006, many lighthouses in seismic areas were designed to be made of reinforced concrete. In 1876, several programs to aid keepers and to benefit their mental health were done, which included campaigns for better pay, providing uniforms, and something that they liked a lot, which was the traveling library, which was basically a giant chest like the size of an old-fashioned steamer chest that had at least 60 leather-bound volumes in it that were printed on paper that in case it was like humid and damp and wet, the paper wouldn't go bad. And things from, say, the Bible to the Odyssey, and these books would go, there were different ones with different books, and so they would get loaned out to various lighthouses, and then once your time would be done, Charlie's across the way, he would get his, you would get yours, and so on and so forth. They absolutely love those things. Now, electrical automation advanced under Taft, which was when we had a lot of advances in foghorns, which brings us to my favorite slide in this entire presentation, which actual quotes from official complaints that people made about foghorns. These are so adorably Victorian. It is the cutest thing. It's like I was reading these the first time and I just pictured somebody like saying this and just dramatically collapsing onto a fainting couch like some period Karen or something. It's hysterical. Okay, moan of a bottomless pit. Roar of 1,000 mad bulls. That's dramatic. Screech like an army of panthers. How in God's name do you know what an army of panthers sounds like? I'd like to know. The groan of a disabled elevator, and my personal favorite for the drama alone, wail of a lost soul. Yes, all passive-aggressive terms by very, very cranky people that did not like foghorns. Now, here is one back on the West Coast, on Oahu to be exact, well, not on the West Coast, Hawaii, obviously. Now, the structure itself is 46 feet tall. I've been over here. It is accessible by a 2-mile round-trip trail. Now, you can't actually go in. You can just see it. Now, it overlooks a 600-foot cliff, which is why there is no way in God's green earth I'm going anywhere close to a 600-foot cliff. I don't care what my husband asked me to do at the time. You are not getting my little butt anywhere close to a 600-foot cliff. No, sir. Now, it was built in 1909. Wickies. Wickies is a very beloved term for lighthouse keepers, meaning, the wicks and the lamp, they lit the lights. If there were 2 or more, they were divided into departments. The first was focused on lighting. The second was focused on maintenance. Now, all their chores had to be done by 10 a.m. to prep for the evening lighting. Now, keepers were usually male, Caucasian. I hate to say it, but there are very, very few recorded instances of any African-American keepers. Some people say that there's none. And they were encouraged to bring a family if they were married. Now, up until the 1770s to 1939, 140 women were listed as the primary keeper of a lighthouse. So they did exist. Now, some famous engineers. Richard Henry Brenton, he was the beloved father to those he called his children. He engineered several very revolutionary lighthouses in Japan. The Lieutenant George Meade, United States Army Corps of Engineers. Thank you, buddy. He was Pacific Coast engineer and a victorious general at Gettysburg. Alexander Mitchell is a brilliant man. He invented the screw pile lighthouse, and he was blind from 1802 on. And also these guys, popularly known as the Lighthouse Stevensons. So the Stevensons were a Scottish family. Robert Stevenson, the patriarch on the left, became just absolutely in love with maritime engineering thanks to his stepfather that just adored him. So 3 sons of Robert, David, Alan, Thomas, all joined in, as does his brother-in-law / stepbrother, Thomas Smith. Now, together, this family was responsible for over 150 lighthouses just in the United Kingdom, several also in Europe, others in Asia. Now, this craft kept continuing throughout the generations, and it was sort of a thing within the family that they were almost insulted when one decided to not become an engineer. One of Robert's grandsons bore his name, and when he decided, because of his ill health and the fact that he wasn't very good at math, he didn't want to be an engineer, they kind of made fun of him a little bit, but he wrote Treasure Island, so he got back at him pretty darn good. Now, some famous rescuers. Grace Darling, she was English, led her family in saving 9 from a wreck in 1838. She became very famous thereafter. Milo the dog, who was a Newfoundland. He was created with saving several small children and became the subject of a lot of very sentimental, saccharine, sort of like portraits at the time. And this wondrous lady on the left is Ida Lewis. She worked at the Lime Rock Lighthouse, and which actually was named after her in 1924, and that is the only lighthouse in this country to have the distinction of being named after a woman. Why? Because this lady was the boss. She saved at least 18 people on record. She was not fond of people publicizing when she did that, so in all probability, the number is probably several times higher. She did not like publicity. She did not like, as she put it, although she appreciated it, she didn't like people calling her out for just doing her duty to her country and God and her people. So that is a very, very wonderful attitude to have. Now, lighthouses today. Contrary to the shade that is the Wikipedia article on lighthouses, they are still in existence. They are still functioning, many of them, in fact. Out of the approximate 800 lighthouses in this country, we don't know because some of them are in private hands. Approximately 60 to 70% of them are still active. Many of these extant ones are, are automated, sorry. Many extant lighthouses are automated. The lighting system is similar to that used to warn aircraft. So say like, when the plane goes down and you know how far away the landing strip is. Now, these lenses are usually LED. And in 2000, we had the National Historic Lighthouse Preservation Act. It transferred lighthouse structures to local governments and nonprofits with the United States Coast Guard, God bless them, maintaining the lamps and lenses. So here we go for a little bit for today. So I hope you all enjoyed yourself. And, to kind of paraphrase the late, great, immortal Johnny Cash is talking to Homer Simpson. Now, go forth and apply your knowledge. Okay. So thank you. Okay, do we have any questions potentially? Come on, I don't bite. I'm very well mannered, really. Yes.
The size of the lens, like we're always the biggest lenses on the tallest lighthouses. Is that how it
Yeah. The biggest ones were on the tallest one. You had the 6-foot Fresnel ones was on the ones for like the harbors. And then it went down in the original 4 orders. As glass technology expanded, they went up to 6, and then eventually I think like 7 or 8. And then if you were having like a harbor light, that was just 1 foot. So depending on the size of the lantern room and what it was going over, yeah, the size of the lenses were different.
One of the questions in the chat line, do you do the New Jersey Lighthouse Challenge?
No, I do not. I have 2 bad legs and a paralyzing fear of heights, so I am not climbing up into lighthouses anytime soon. I was, many, many years ago, I was actually at the top of the Cape May one, which again is gorgeous. It's absolutely beautiful. and I almost got sick taking the elevator to the top of the Washington Monument. So heights and I are not a good thing. I love, like, they're very, very beautiful, obviously, but, and of course I had the honor of seeing the one at Alcatraz, but yes, I have not done the Lighthouse Challenge, but that is a wonderful thing for anybody to Google if you're interested in it.
Next question is, how many lighthouses are used? Say,
Houses that we don't, I actually tried to look that up, that we can't get a number on because so many of them are in private hands. We don't really know what is private property in this country. So that's why I said approximately 800 lighthouses in this country now. So, I mean, if you do the math, if they estimate, like, say 60 to 70% of what are 800 of them, so then that remaining, like, yeah, so maybe about, like, say 600 of them ballpark are still in existence, which means roughly 200 are used as private structures. Now, typically, those actually aren't as houses. A lot of them are as museums.
Yeah.
I found at least.
Yeah. So the person about the New Jersey Lighthouse Challenge also said you still can look at them, and also said there is a B&B in Rhode Island at the Rose Island Lighthouse. So I guess if you are interested in staying in one, that's something you can do. Are there any other questions?
It depends. It depends on the conditions, what they're trying to do, even things like the weather. That's why you have the stationary lights and the other lights that aren't. I mean, stationary ones, it can be just where they blink like at a steady time. Like you have a light that goes out at a time like that, light goes out at a time like that, instead of blinking like it's Morse code. And that would kind of depend on what they had at the time. Now, this is going to be a really, really weird analogy, but just to poke this up, this is from the 8th season of The Simpsons. It's one of my favorite all-time episodes. It's basically Homer Simpson goes insane and a space coyote, voiced by Johnny Cash, becomes a spirit guide. Don't ask, it's a long story. So that right there was a steady light. So it's not like blinking intermittently until Homer breaks it by purpose. So yes, that's a weird comparison, but still, it's looking all the way out to the coast. It's a steady light because you don't want something blinking too intermittently, because what then if, you know, heaven forbid, somebody turns by a wrong course by it. Now, what did identify them a lot were actually the day marks, the candy stripe markings. Yes, you couldn't see them during the night typically, but what it would be was as these various people involved with the ships would go past during the daytime, they would get to see them, and they had unique markings, unique patterns, and they would get to recognize them and be like, okay, well, here's the red stripe one with the polka dots. I can turn right here. The shoals are in this condition here. So the day marks were for people that recognize them, really more so typically than the lights. Although they could, you can, I found, get to recognize them by just the tone of the light. I think that may sound kind of weird, but I found that by all the times you go to Cape May, no matter how many times I see video of the Cape May Lighthouse at Cape May Point, you can still recognize the light that's in it. Maybe it's because you get so used to seeing something, you can kind of poke it out from a crowd, but they are. I mean, if you see it enough, you can definitely distinguish it. Yep. Sometimes, yeah, some of them would flash. That wouldn't be necessarily just anything out of the ordinary. Sometimes it would just be here I am, you just stay, you know, avoid this area, stay out. Yeah. Yeah, they had different reasons. Yeah, they had different reasons for doing it. It seems when I looked into that, it seems like the ones that had the more blinking lights weren't in the areas that were as dangerous. It was more so just like, I don't want to say a casual warning, but it was just more like a, hey, how are you? Just, you know, stay away from here type of deal. Because if it was a they don't, I mean, the larger lights that produced all that extra illumination, they were a lot more in technology than the other ones. So you don't need a giant light in an area that's not as sort of dangerous, not as treacherous. So I would presume that that would be why they didn't put them there, and they would instead just put the, hey, here I am, just, you know, just avoid here type of deal. That's at least what I would guess. I mean, not having really gotten a straight answer on that myself, that's what I would presume that they did.
You said before that in Alexandria you can swim along the ruins of the one. Did you do that?
I didn't do that because the tour group actually canceled that at the very last minute. I got very, very mad. I went to Egypt to see the Pharos, the Colossus of Roads, and the pyramids, which are of course in Egypt, are all part of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And I wanted to see all of them. And I went there specifically for that, and the blasted tour company canceled it at the very last minute, and I was so mad. I know one friend that did it, and he lords it over me like Zeus. He gets to do all those interesting things. He went to Transylvania once during some Dracula festival even. He does all these really neat, interesting trips, and then he's like, here, here, here. And he's just so adorable that nobody wants to think ill of him. But then privately, we're all just, it's like, come on. Yep. I happen to have, because I am a shameless self-promoter, I'm in charge of the Facebook page, and I'm also the vice president. So my husband, when he wants to be sarcastic, he calls me Madam Vice President. I am.
All right.
I'm looking for them right now, but I have flyers.
Does anyone have any more questions? This is also for people online as well. If you have any other questions, I will gladly read them out.
What would happen if the lighthouse people would have to leave an emergency right away?
There was actually basically a code of ethics where you weren't supposed to leave. Now, there have been cases of people, like, because of course they encourage married couples to do it. So then the obvious question is, well, what if the wife goes into labor? A lot of babies were born at lighthouses. There were a couple of people that were actually disciplined for various reasons. There's one famous story of a young man who was 17. It was his first job, and he got locked outside during basically a polar vortex at a lighthouse. And he just kept there, kept polishing the light, kept cleaning it, and he won a special award for it. It was sort of an international thing where you weren't supposed to leave your lighthouse. My favorite story of that is actually with volcano Krakatoa. It's not Krakatoa, that's not the proper name. My teacher goes to Indonesia all the time, my one professor. It's Krakatoa. So accompanying that blast, which was the loudest sound ever recorded by man, of course, there was a tsunami. Now, the lighthouse keeper over at, I believe it was Kedembang, he saw the water recede, and when he saw it, he knew what it was, and he called for his wife and his son to run, just like leave as fast as they possibly could. The lighthouse was knocked off of its foundations. The wife didn't make it, the son did not make it, and that man, I swear to you, he stood there with a lantern over his bodies, their bodies, still warning people to stay away that whole time. Now it's like a, I don't want to compare like apples to oranges too much, but having a lot of family members and friends in the military, it's pretty much like that. And in law enforcement, there's a brotherhood. It's understood that you don't leave your post. That's just, you know, your post is your family, your post is your kin. You don't leave your post. I mean, a couple of people did, and yes, there are cases of folks being fired, but all in all, I mean, in emergencies, a couple of times, yeah, they were pretty understandable.
There's nothing in the chat, so.
Okay. Yep.
Well, I know it's awkward because I'm in the back of the room, but I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. We really appreciate it, and check out our calendar We have people saying thank you in the chat and enjoy the presentation. I know I enjoyed the presentation. So thank you, everyone.